Welcome to Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell. This is the place where we dive into the world of talent acquisition, explore the challenges of today's workplace, and discover what it takes to build a thriving and successful organization.
Today, I'm joined by Rohit Bhargava, a renowned futurist, best-selling author, and keynote speaker on a mission to inspire more non-obvious thinking in the world. As the founder of the Non-Obvious Company and a former marketing strategist at Ogilvy and Leo Burnett, Rohit has delivered engaging presentations in 32 countries, helping leaders and organizations see opportunities others miss and navigate the future with innovative insights. Rohit, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me.
No problem. So let's start with the book. What inspired you to write Non-Obvious Thinking? See how to see what others miss.
It was really the obvious thinking I saw out there that I think was the biggest inspiration for us. I think we're surrounded by obvious. We're surrounded by the same ideas, the same way of thinking, and we can get stuck, any of us. It doesn't matter how creative we are. It doesn't matter how open-minded we think we are. I think we can all get stuck. And this book was really meant to try and encourage people to break out of that and to choose to see new ideas and to seek them out and to appreciate them.
Very good. So you share a framework called SIFT, S-I-F-T. Can you explain that framework a little bit?
Yeah, the SIFT framework, and by the way, I've spent most of my career in marketing, so I'm all about the acronyms. Uh,
There
and
you
and
go.
yeah, it was a great word. It really it has a meaning on its own,
Yep.
because when you're sifting through something, you're sort of separating what is meaningful from the noise. And the acronym stands for creating space, which is the S, finding insights, which is the I, focusing your attention, which is the F, and then defining a twist. And the twist is where an idea or a thought becomes non-obvious, and that's the T.
Perfect. Excellent. So, how did you develop the framework? Or was it just, did it come to you, or was it after, research or, working with other groups? How did you develop this framework?
So this is an interesting one because I'd been writing about non-obvious ideas for more than 10 years. And in fact, the thing I was known best for was my non-obvious trend series, which was a series of books that I published, a new version of that book with new trends every single year for 10 years between 2010 and 2020. And so that was the best-selling series, and everybody was like, "Oh, tell me what the next trends are," because, at the end of every year, beginning of every year, we love trends. Everybody does. And so it was really great for me. It was profitable for my business. It drove a lot of keynote speaking for me. But over time, what people started wondering is, well, what's the method behind that? Like, how do you define these trends? How do you think in the sort of way to ask these questions, to put these pieces together to see where the future is headed? And about 2 years ago, I met Ben Dupont, my co-author. And for the last 20 years, he'd been hosting a dinner called the Non-Obvious Dinner. So we didn't know each other, but we were both using this lingo of non-obvious. And for me, I was publishing books and writing about this and training and teaching people. And for him, he was creating a community. And at this non-obvious dinner every year, everyone would be challenged to bring their most non-obvious world-changing idea, and they would pitch it to their table. And the best idea from each table would then get pitched to the entire room. And it was all about sharing big ideas. And so what he had learned from people coming up with these big ideas and what I had learned from teaching and training in all these companies about non-obvious thinking, we put those pieces together to come up with this framework of these four elements of non-obvious thinking. And that's when we wrote this book.
Nice. Very good. So, we have various leaders that listen to this podcast. How can leaders cultivate more non-obvious thinking in their organizations?
So this is the beautiful thing that sometimes we think, especially leaders, that if we want more creative organizations, what we have to do is create some sort of a nexus for that creativity, which leads us towards, here's our innovation lab. Here's our new creative, agency that's going to come in. Put it in a box, exactly. And it delivers exactly the result you would think it would deliver, which is that creativity stays in one place. It doesn't really transcend throughout the organization. And you unintentionally tell everyone else in the organization that if creativity or the word creative is not on their business card, it's not their job, which is not what you want, right? You want that to go throughout the organization. So the only way to do that is to institute some sort of mindset shift. And the mindset shift is what I really spend most of my time training and teaching to groups on how do you do that? And how do you do it in a way where someone doesn't have to think to themselves, oh, I'm a creative professional, therefore I do this. Everyone can think to themselves, I could do a little bit more of this. And that's really what this 4-step process is meant to deliver. It's meant to deliver a way for anyone to think this way.
Can you share, do you have any specific examples that you could share about how non-obvious thinking maybe has led to a breakthrough in your career or someone else's?
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about writing a book like this is that there's a combination of stories from history and stories from like modern time or from my career or from Ben's career. So, one example from history that I love that a lot of people maybe don't know is about Dr. Seuss, and that he wrote more than 60 books that were best-selling books. I mean, beloved children's book author. And he has 2 books that are more famous than any of his other books, and more best-selling than any of his other books.
Was Green Eggs and Ham one of them?
Yes, it was. That was actually number 1. And number 2 was Cat in the Hat. But what a lot of people don't know about those books is that they were both written based on a challenge. And the first challenge was write a book with as few unique words as possible, and that was, Cat in the Hat. That had 236 unique words. That was it in the entire book, 236 different words, and that was hugely successful. And after that book was written, his new editor issued him another challenge, which is, can you write a book with less than 50 words? Which seemed like it would be impossible to make
Impossible,
a
yeah.
good story with that few words. But that book ended up being Green Eggs and Ham, his number 1 best-selling book. So Dr. Seuss's number 1 best-selling book is also the same book that used the fewest number of unique words. And so what lesson can we take away from that? One of the things we talk about in the book is that there's a real power in adding constraints to be able to be creative within those sorts of constraints. And it's all about focus, which is the F from the SIFT method. How do you find your focus? And the story of Dr. Seuss finding his focus to be able to write with that constraint was not only commercially successful, but it became beloved as an actual book, the story that he was able to come up with there. Now, he's got a level of creative talent that probably most of us don't have, but the idea behind doing that is something we can all replicate. How do we give ourselves constraints, or as leaders, how do we give our teams the right sort of constraints so that we encourage them to come up with these solutions that they might not come up with otherwise?
Yeah, when I was working at Bose, Dr. Bose used to always say that, yeah, you can build an amazing piece of sound, but we're trying to do it within a certain cost constraints. And, how good can we make it within, so, if you have a $50,000 sound system, that's going to outperform this, but we don't have that kind of budget for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of examples of that, like, Kendo Koji, the guy who developed the theme song for Super Mario Brothers, like, he was working under the same constraints, right? He had to do, like, 5 notes, and it could only have a certain number of kilobytes because, like, the game was trying to be packaged as small
That's
as
right.
possible, and,
Right.
so there's a lot of examples throughout history of that.
Awesome. So are there ways that HR professionals can apply non-obvious thinking to improve their hiring practices? I mean, a lot of what we talk about in Fire Your Hiring Habits is how do you find and keep the best people? So,
Mhm.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things is to perhaps challenge the things that we often think are the most important. So in HR and hiring in particular, one of the immediate biases that we all have is, how do we hire someone with a lot of industry experience?
Yeah.
And at the same time, what we're trying to do is hire someone who will have new ways of thinking.
Do it differently. Yeah,
Which is sort of opposite if you think about
exactly.
it, right? Someone who's been successful in the industry doing, the work in that industry for 15 years is pretty likely to do more of the same, as opposed to someone coming from another industry that could be analogous that switches over. And I think that the companies that have done something really new and innovative have adopted this sort of hiring process. I mean, when Apple, the company that was known for making devices, decided they were going to open a retail store, they brought over a experienced retail executive who had no technology experience at all. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to create a retail experience that would be a great retail experience, not something
This
that a
technology is
technology person would come up with, right? And it's a classic example, but we don't use that mindset often enough when it comes to HR and hiring in other industries and other sectors, and we could.
Yeah, that's great. I know one of the other kind of differentiating or thinking different ways that I hear about or am at least asked about a lot in the HR front is, do we require degrees or are certifications enough? Can we get away from, mandating that you have a bachelor's or something like that? And so another way that people are thinking different about, their hiring practices.
Yeah, and I do think that it is tough because when you have a lot of applications for something, or when you have a lot of potential candidates for something, you have to use some way
Yeah, you
of
have some
narrowing
sort
it
of
down,
filter.
right? Yeah, but the filter doesn't always have to be what school did they go to or what degree do they have. Maybe it's, what special interests do they mention? Do they mention any at all? And you don't consider any resumes that don't mention anything personal about that person, because someone who is more forthcoming about their personal side is maybe a little bit more uh, of a good fit for being kind
Yeah,
of
a
a
deep
potential candidate,
player
right?
or,
Like,
can relate to people or something. Yeah, be great.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know that that's the thing, but the point is, like, if you need to narrow it down based on something, like, find something that is a little more authentic than just rather than just a data point.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. Um, so diversity. What role does diversity play in non-obvious thinking with teams?
Diversity is an interesting topic. I mean, I wrote not my previous book, but a book that we released back in 2022 was all about diversity. It was called Beyond Diversity. And the reason I wrote that book was because we were in this moment where people were really considering, like, what are my blind spots? And we all have them, right? It doesn't make you a bad person to have blind spots or to have biases. We all have biases. We all have blind spots. And there was a lot of emotion and maybe political uh, ramifications of having biases or even admitting that you had them.
Yeah.
And I hope that maybe we've evolved a little bit further than that. And the book was meant to sort of describe how we could do that. And the bias of the book was that a more inclusive, more diverse corporate environment, working environment was better for everyone. Because you would be exposed to new ideas, you would be exposed to new people. And we were very forthcoming about the idea that diversity did not just mean, in our way of thinking, did not just mean hiring more people of the opposite gender or any other gender. It did not just mean hiring more minorities. It also meant looking at, do you have age diversity? Do you have enough people from different generations working in your organization? Do you have diversity of people who have experience from different industries or different backgrounds instead of somebody who has the same background? All these people have the same background, same degree. So there was all these different elements of it, and the most fundamental principle that we really talked about, which is quite well known in the world of diversity and inclusion, is intersectionality. This idea that we have to appreciate people for their intersectional identities, not just see them as one thing, but see them as more things. And that was pretty fundamental.
Yeah, in one of the chapters of the book, or my book, we talk exclusively about that. That it's more than, like you said, it's more than just gender or ethnicity. It's, experience, geography, education, it's just a whole, I talk about it as potpourri, right? Potpourri smells great and it is very aromatic when you get a lot of different ingredients involved. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more that, so when you have that good mix, that leads to more non-obvious thinking, you find?
It can, if we listen, because there's also a lot of performative actions that happen in this space where someone might get hired or brought into an organization because they are trying to make it more diverse and inclusive, but they don't actually create an environment where that
Where
person
they
feels
can.
like they belong.
Yeah, a safe
And when you
place.
don't create belonging, then you're not going to have that benefit because someone feels isolated and they feel not listened to.
Yeah, we talk about, be allowing an individual to bring their whole selves to work, if you will, as opposed to having to leave certain aspects of them out. And if the culture does not, um, you know, support that, then yeah, you're not going to get anything more out of them. You're just going to get whatever you're asking for at best.
Yeah, that's right, and that happens too often.
So on the culture front, is there a culture element to this that, how, what is there any practical advice you can give the listeners with respect to creating a culture that would encourage and potentially reward non-obvious thinking?
I do think that there's a lot of cultures that say that they want creativity, say that they want innovation, but their incentive models don't actually support that at all. And so what people feel like is if they're going to come up with something new, that it will either get shot down and not get funded and not get listened to, or it will be so risky that they're putting their careers on the line in order to actually propose something new or different. And when you have a culture like that, you're essentially preventing people from sharing their best unusual thinking and being really non-obvious with how they approach things, and that predictably fails. So I do think that you really have to create a sort of culture where the incentives are there for someone to do things in new ways and to challenge the way that things have been done so that they feel like when they do it, that sort of insight is welcomed.
So have you seen some companies that have done a good job with incentivizing this? What kind of examples of good incentives have you seen that have worked in, not that every incentive is going to work in every culture, but just to spur some thinking?
Well, there's big and small ways that I've seen to do this that really can work. So having some sort of an internal innovation prize, some sort of an award, some sort of contest that can encourage the best big idea or the most interesting one. Like it creates this dynamic of competition, and that can work on a big level. On a small level, when you have your weekly meetings, people can be encouraged to bring in some sort of a new idea or a story of something that's happening that's not part of your industry, like an outside industry story. And everyone has to share one story, or maybe each week someone is charged with finding a couple of these stories. This is like a small way to say to people, you always have to be looking at what else is happening in the world. It's not enough to just put your head down, do your work, deliver your stuff, and that's it. We want you to be thinking about what's going on and paying attention to the world. And we're incentivizing that because we're encouraging you to bring those stories to the team meeting.
Excellent. Yeah, I like that. So both the big picture as well as here's your daily opportunity to bring this to light. Are there well, let me just ask, what are some practical exercises that leaders can use to develop their non-obvious thinking skills?
So there's a few. One is that you can change your rituals. So one of the things that I loved reading and retelling the story of was famous chef Ferran Adria, who's quite well known for being one of the inventors of molecular gastronomy as a whole kind of category. And when he was interviewed for the Time magazine, like most interesting or most fascinating people list, one of the questions the journalist asked him is, how do you stay so creative? Like, how do you keep that creative energy going? And he said, one of the things I do is every morning when I wake up, I have a different fruit for breakfast every day for the whole month. And that one thing in the beginning of his day sends a signal to his brain that today's not going to be like yesterday. And you don't have to be a world-class chef to do that. Like, you could do that yourself. And after the first kind of 10 or 12 or 15 days even, when you go through all the fruits that that are easily available, now you gotta kinda get creative. You gotta go to an ethnic grocery store to find some of these fruits. You gotta, like, do a little bit of work to have enough different fruits to eat. But doing that effort allows you to send that signal to your brain to say, "Today's not like yesterday." And that's the starting point for new ideas, and it's something that any of us can do. So it's changing those habits, right? And maybe it's
Yeah.
the different fruit every morning. Maybe it's like, changing the order of how you do things. If you typically work out and then have breakfast and then like, read stories or whatever, that change the order, right?
Yeah, my father used to always talk about, "Hey, I try to drive home a different way from work every day. Take a different road that I haven't seen just to kind of break things up." And as you were telling that, I keep, my mind goes back to the old Steve Martin stand-up routines when he used to talk about how to, people would ask him, "How are you so funny?" He said, "Well, I put a slice of bologna in each shoe. That way I feel funny, when I go out there on stage." So anyway,
Exactly. You got to change it up, right?
you got to do something
Maybe that's
different.
the way. Maybe that's what we should all do.
So how does non-obvious thinking relate to addressing skills gaps in today's workforce?
Well, I think that one of the ways that it really helps is that being a non-obvious thinker means that you have brought more curiosity into your day and into your mindset. And when you have more curiosity, you start to embrace things that are new and sometimes scary, such as AI. Like someone who has curiosity will look at AI and say, okay, maybe it'll take my job or change the way that our industry's done, but that's just what people are writing about. Let me try this thing for myself.
Yeah.
And when you go and try this thing for yourself, and when you play with ChatGPT, and when you play with Perplexity, and when you play with some of these tools, you realize not only what they're capable of, but what their limitations are. And when you see what their limitations are, which are pretty severe still at the moment, you can't just press one button and have it write a book for you. It's not good. Trust me, I tried, right? But when you see that for yourself, you see what the limitations are and you have perspective that actually makes your skills more valuable. Because now you're not just talking from the point of view of, oh, I read an article about AI and it can do this and it can do that, and you're kind of talking out of your ass, pardon my French. What you're actually doing is talking based on your experience to say, I tried this and this is how it works and this is what it does. And you would be amazed at how many people will never do that. I will go to a talk. I used to do this sometimes, and I would say, "Who's heard of ChatGPT?" And, I don't know, 80%, 90% of people raise their hands. Now it's probably close to 100. And then I would say, "Who's actually downloaded and tried it?" And it was like 1% of the room, and maybe now it's more than that, hopefully, but it's
So,
still not gonna be as many people as you think.
yeah, it's not the mass majority of those that raise their hands. Uh,
No.
so you talk about, curiosity. I've been wanting to ask this question since we set up this interview. So the world's most dangerous playground. Can you tell us how what that teaches us about embracing radical curiosity?
Yeah, that's a story from the book about a place that was actually featured in a documentary. It's a playground called The Land. And on this playground, children are encouraged to do things that would be considered out of bounds and dangerous elsewhere, like play with hammers, play with fire, have like scraps of metal that they can rebuild into various things. And it was this very unique idea of a playground that said, we're not going to have the typical rules because we're going to see what happens when kids are just allowed to play. And it sounds like a diabolical social experiment, like something that should probably be banned at some point. But they did study it. They studied what happened, and they saw some really interesting results coming from that. One was that the kids, when they had more dangerous opportunities to play, actually helped one another to stay safe. And the other was that they adjusted their behavior so that they wouldn't hurt themselves. And this is something that I think in our overly bubble wrapped world of what we allow our kids to do and what we allow ourselves to do, there's a lesson in there about maybe injecting a little bit more danger into our lives and teaching that it's okay to have that because even though it's a risk, we learn how to deal with that and we become more resilient as a result. And that was really the lesson that I took away from that story.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I hear about it may not have been the world's most dangerous playground as an experiment, but you hear about, you know, uh, other countries where, the kids are able to do this stuff at a very young age and they manage themselves. They're taught the safety rules around it and they okay, I know not to, try the chainsaw on my arm and or whatever the case may be. Um,
Yeah, and it is, I mean, there are some boundaries and some limits, and, you don't want to set your kids up to, like, have serious accidents or anything, but it's on every level. It's not just
yeah,
danger,
lighting
it's
a
also
fire, or like,
yeah,
as a
lighting a
6-year-old.
fire or just teaching responsibility. Like, you look at some of these stories of how Japanese elementary schools, for example, like, teach children responsibility, and, like, there's no janitors in a elementary school in Japan, like, they clean up after themselves. They're taught to. On every level, including cleaning the bathrooms. And that's just part of what they're taught and how they are brought up within that school environment. So I think there are modern examples of that that are really interesting to look at and to share.
All right. So let me switch just a little bit here. So enigmatology. How does this help us discover hidden aspects of problems or situations?
Yeah, enigmatology is a fun one because it's really it's a study of puzzles is basically what it is. And Will Shortz, the famous crossword puzzle editor for the New York Times,
Mhm.
has a degree in enigmatology. I think he was the first in the world to have that degree. And the story of it and how we talk about it is that when you are trying to find uh, these enigmas, these mysteries, you can essentially do what in marketing and business I would call assigning meaning to trivia, trivial things. So you see examples of this quite often. So if you think about like Stella Artois, the beer, and the way that it's served in this golden chalice with this glass that has the golden rim on it, like you could serve any beer in that glass, but you don't. You only serve that beer in that glass. And it's this invented ritual that is created because of some sort of mystery of like maybe they used to have like we sort of feel like, oh, the kings maybe way
Yeah,
back
maybe they.
used to have the
Yeah,
beer
yeah.
this way, but it's totally invented. But the idea is if you can invent that story and then assign it meaning, it becomes meaningful. And when it becomes meaningful, then it's this way of having a twist, right? And that's the chapter that is part of the twist. You have this way of standing out based on how you've created something that is different.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I like that. So it may be an artificial construct, but as long as you assign meaning to it, it suddenly becomes more important.
Sometimes, I mean, you have to commit to it. Like there are a lot of people who
Yeah,
might
yeah.
try that and nobody would care, right? I mean, you have to commit to it and be there for that long term around something like that, and you have to avoid the temptation to go, straight towards something that immediately feels like bullshit, right? So there is a line that you have to be able to manage there.
Very good. All right, I'm still pulling on little threads here so people can get a flavor of the book here. But so, how can a 7-minute meetup reinvent networking, and why is this important to professionals?
Yeah, the 7-minute meetup has been hugely popular. So whenever I go and do these keynotes now, a lot of times I will add on a 7-minute meetup. And the idea is that it's based on two things that people know. The first thing people know is that networking is important. Second thing people know is that they hate networking. And the reason we hate it is because we have to be this most outgoing, intimidating version of ourselves. And everyone else has to be that too. And so we end up going to these things where we don't really make that many authentic conversations. And instead, we just talk about the weather or like something trivial and insignificant. And the idea of the 7-minute meetup is that we transform the way that we network simply by changing the one question that we ask. And the one question that we should ask, and in this 7-minute meetup, the one question everyone is encouraged to ask is, what's something non obvious about you? And then you answer, and their only goal after you answer is to ask you a question about it that will elicit a story. So if you said the non-obvious thing about me is that I went skydiving, I might ask you after that, "Oh, did you always want to go skydiving? Was it scary? Did you, would you go again?" I ask you something that encourages you to tell me a little bit more about it, and then we switch. You tell me something non-obvious about you, and then, and then we switch that way. I tell you, and then you ask me a question. In that way, over 7 minutes, you have a much more authentic connection with someone, and it completely transforms the way that you now experience that networking, moment. And
Yeah, you
that's
get
the
that
power of
emotional
doing something
connection
like
of the
this.
story as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and what it does is, in the book, we talk about this as an oasis moment. A moment in time when we can create this connection that allows us to have more space for ourselves and to make these connections with people that are sometimes difficult to make because we don't naturally have a language for it. And so that's what we tried to give people with this, a language to do it. And in fact, we have a whole one-page guide on the website on how to host your own 7-minute meetup. And you can just download it and you can host your own.
That's perfect. Yeah. I was invited to I donate to various things. I was invited to a donor recognition dinner, and it said bring a plus one. I was out of town and my niece happened to live in the area. She was a college student going to a university nearby. Invited her there. She was so nervous. She's like, "Oh, how?" And this is exactly what we tried to practice. We didn't have. I wish I could have given her the 7-minute meetup clue, but I said, so if you want to figure out how to network, ask these people what they do. Just say start learning, and it was funny the advice that she would get from people around the table, et cetera. So it's definitely a skill that, it's definitely a task that is critical and is very helpful, but as you say, not exactly everybody's favorite thing.
Right. Yeah, and if you give them a language to like you were trying to do with your niece, it makes it a little less intimidating.
Yeah, exactly. Just say, "Hey, we're all going through this. I don't care if that person, you know, has, 20, 30 more years of experience in life than you do, but it's still, challenging. So what are your secrets,
Right, exactly.
Very good. So you also talk about the termite mounds of Zimbabwe. What lessons can businesses learn from the termite mounds of Zimbabwe?
Yeah, the termite mounds of Zimbabwe are a fascinating example of how they keep cool. So there was an architect in Zimbabwe who saw these termite mounds, and they're huge. I mean, they can be like 10 feet, 15 feet tall. I mean, if you've never seen them in pictures or in person, they are really impressive. And the way that and they're in very hot places. But the system of the holes and how the air actually circulates is the way that they're able to keep it cool. And an architect who saw that when he was on the golf course, he basically kind of looked off in the distance and saw them and thought, well, maybe I could create a self-cooling building in the architectural sense from that. And that's what he did. And he created a building and commissioned it. And there's photos of it that you can find. It's in Zimbabwe, and it's really quite interesting the way it looks. But the idea behind that, the insight there was that if you're paying attention to the things that are happening around you, if you're paying attention to the natural world, sometimes the solution to your challenge or the solution to your problem is right there. The problem is that we're just, looking down at our phone and not paying attention. And so we walk right past it.
It's like
And
Velcro, right? Came from the plant, connections and things
exactly.
like that.
Velcro is a perfect example, right? Or Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, like the way Starbucks became, he had the idea for a third place, not work, not home, but a third place where people could hang out based on walking down the street in Milan while he was at a coffee trade show. And that led to creating what Starbucks became. And if he was walking down that street, sending that last text message, looking at his phone, maybe he doesn't notice those cafes and
Going
maybe he
right
doesn't
by it.
have that inspiration, right?
Yeah, that's great. So we've shared a few different ways of non-obvious thinking or tools and techniques. Can you share some success stories of companies that have embraced non-obvious thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the Khan Academy is a great example. I mean, Sal Khan did a endorsement for the book, which was very kind of him. But like, if you think about what the Khan Academy did, they took the concept of the classroom and helped flip it. So instead of learning based on the lecture in the class and then doing your homework at home, you would learn based on the video. And many people now, they go into class and they get help doing the homework. But this idea that you could learn digitally through videos and through all of these things, and even more now that AI could be this personalized tutor, and he has, if you haven't seen it yet, Sal Khan has this amazing TED Talk where he essentially talks about the future of education and AI, which a lot of people are really worried about, right? Like they're worried that AI and ChatGPT and everybody's going to write their essays with ChatGPT, and we'll have a whole generation of kids who don't know how to write or express themselves. I mean, that's a big concern right
Yeah,
now.
for sure.
And what he talks about is the potential for AI to personalize tutoring to the level that every kid could have an individualized teacher who understands exactly how they need to learn and helps them learn, which is this promise of AI that we don't hear enough discussion about. And it's really fascinating the vision that he has for that and the Khan Academy is putting in place for something like that. So, like, you want to talk about a success story of someone who's using non obvious thinking to transform an entire sector, which is education. I mean, that's a perfect one.
Yeah, the education sector, it's always been the holy grail. How do we teach what you don't already know? How do we discover and reinforce the things that because tests only go so far. And so if you can have more of a, I hate to call it big brother, the whole view, but if somebody were actually observing and go, hey, actually you're a little weak in this area. Maybe we should
Yeah.
work on that. And it's one of the areas, as we provide training to the electronics industry from IPC, it's the big challenge is what, yeah, maybe they passed the test, but what didn't they actually answer, as you go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of examples like that. I mean, in the food category, I'd say Oatly is another great example of a company that almost single-handedly got people to think about oat milk as an option instead of just dairy milk. And now it's exploded to all different types of milk, right? And it's very unusual, like the thinking that's required to go into starting something like that and getting people to change their habits or change their diets and go to that that level. So we're surrounded by really interesting examples of people and organizations who've been able to take this sort of non-obvious thinking and implement it in different ways.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the positive sides and all the gains from it. Are there potential pitfalls or challenges of implementing non-obvious thinking in an organization?
I think that there are there are probably the same pitfalls that you would imagine if you encourage a lot of innovation and creativity within an organization, and then sometimes it just doesn't pan out. So there's always a risk of failure anytime you do
Sure.
something new and different. Uh, in my opinion, it's not enough of a risk to prevent you from doing that because the risk of not doing it is much higher, stagnating and doing the same thing and kind of losing your edge. But there's probably risks around that. Um, I think that the I think that's probably the only sort of downside I would see if I had to name a downside. But at the end of the day, what I've seen from organizations and leaders in general is that encouraging more open-minded thinking, encouraging more innovation, and letting people embrace their most creative side of themselves is something that is deeply needed and does not result in negative outcomes generally.
Yeah. I usually, when I'm interviewing folks, in fact, almost 100%, one of the last questions I'll ask them, or if I only have 5 minutes, it's the only question I'll ask them. I ask them about, what are you passionate about? And, they'll share their passion and I explain why. And I share all the upsides of having a group of passionate people, working with you. And then I said, so, but there's a downside too. And the downside is you're working with a bunch of passionate people. And so similarly, I think, because, passionate people get pretty passionate. So we want to make sure you maintain respect. I could see something similar happening if everybody's just being super creative, then, not every idea can be put to the forefront or can be implemented by an organization. And so you just have to, I tell people, it's like, you may be exactly right about your passionate idea. We're going to go this way. And when we fail, we may
Yeah.
come back to this.
Yeah, I could see that, or potentially, you have a scenario where there's like too many too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. You could
Yeah.
run into something like that
Something like that.
as well. Yeah,
The only other concern I have is that if people don't understand it, if they just say, "Oh, well, we're going to implement, non-obvious thinking in our thing," and it just becomes another box to generate creativity, as we talked about earlier, as opposed to really engaging and allowing people the opportunities to be successful in it, I think is the other possible danger. If it's not done well, people will sit there and say, "Oh, it's just another program that they're throwing at us that we don't pay attention to." So, let me encourage those who are listening to definitely not only read the book but engage with Rohit and his organization to really figure out how to leverage non-obvious thinking in a world that things just tend to get a little bit too rote sometimes. I think it's very important. And I think what you've done is a very powerful work. And I appreciate it of not only the work you've done, but also joining us here on the podcast today.
well, thank you so much, and thanks for all of the very insightful questions.
Our pleasure. So for those of you listening, be sure to join us on our next video podcast on Fire Your Hiring Habits.
This has been Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you want to empower your organization to reach new heights, go to johnwmitchell.com to find the techniques and tools you need to attract and retain the best team and boldly reimagine your workplace. Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell is a production of Forbes Books.